This is Stereoactive Presents. I'm your host, Jeremiah Lee McVeigh. And welcome to the third installment of Useless Useful, in which we discuss topics of interest broken into two categories. Useless covers topics that have to do with pop culture, music, film, etc. And the term useless is used lovingly, harkening back to the DIY Brooklyn venue Fort Useless and the community around that. Useful covers topics like relief efforts, charitable campaigns, and social issues that we want to draw attention to. We'll also share about projects going on at Stereoactive Media. All right, so here is our first useless item. And again, useless is used lovingly. So When the Clock Broke, Conmen, Conspiracists, and How America Cracked Up in the early 1990s is a book by John Ganz that I've been reading. I'm only about a third of a way through it right now, but I already consider it a valuable sort of decoder ring for both the 1990s and really today. Early on, it gets into the rise of David Duke to sort of quasi-mainstream perch in the GOP as he tried to move past his KKK and Nazi past, or at least he framed it that way. And eventually it gets to some of the even further mainstreaming of some of what Duke stood for that occurred when Pat Buchanan ran his insurgent 1992 primary campaign against incumbent President George H.W. Bush. It's impossible to read either of these sections and not recognize the pretty clear parallels with the more recent rise of the Donald Trump era, which we're currently living through. Really, though, I guess it's more that Trump is indebted to Duke and Buchanan for widening the so-called Overton Window enough for him to slither through. The book is much more wide-ranging than just those two important stories, though. And best of all, it's a really smooth read that manages to thread a lot of needles in a seemingly effortless way. So I highly recommend it. And this actually brings me to our second useless item. It's related. That is Unclear and Present Danger, a podcast hosted by John Ganz and Jamel Bowie. This is a show that combines often kind of trashy but really fun pop culture with rather highbrow, insightful takes on, again, the 1990s, often related, again, to our current day. I started listening to this show because I was a fan of Jamel Bowie, both for his incredibly sharp writing about current events and his appearances on podcasts that I already enjoyed, namely Blank Check, Doughboys, and We Hate Movies. Though now that I think about it, actually, I believe I first came to know him through his appearances on a different type of podcast, Slate's Political Gabfest, where he often joined from time to time to kind of talk about whatever was going on in the politics of the day and would be like kind of a fill-in co-host sometimes. So Unclear and Present Danger focuses on action movies and thrillers that came out after the Cold War. Their first episode covered 1990's The Hunt for Red October, and they've moved pretty much chronologically from there, with their most recent episode covering 1997's The Saint. My favorite part of the show tends to be when they look at the front page of the New York Times for the day of a film's release and pick out some of the stories that might offer a bit of context for something in the movie or even related to today. And their takes on the films themselves tend to delve into the politics either on or kind of under the surface of the narrative and how that may or may not connect with the politics of the time. To my mind, the show is a really kind of perfect amalgamation of both high and low brow, and it's both extremely entertaining and informative. When I first started listening, I'd heard of John Ganz, but didn't really know much about him. But I really came to enjoy listening to him and Jamel Bowie talk. And over the course of the show, I heard Ganz talk about the book he was writing that really tied well into the theme of the show. So it was really great to finally go out and buy When the Clock Broke once it was out, going back to my first so-called useless item. So yeah, I definitely suggest this show if you are either into action movies and thrillers from the 90s or recent history or both. It's a really good mix. And now for something completely unrelated to John Ganz, and at least not directly related to the 1990s. It's a bonus third useless item, and again, used lovingly, the term useless. Mahashmashana is the latest album from Father John Misty, and I'm enjoying it immensely. I have to admit that for quite a while after I first became aware of Father John Misty, I was resistant to his kind of whole thing. In retrospect, I admittedly think I mistook for hipster shtick what was actually satirical observation, if that makes sense. For whatever reason, though, sometime in 2020, at the height of the pandemic, I had one of his songs on, and the tone of it just hit me perfectly in that moment. And I locked in to his particular lyrical bent. It's kind of a mix of tones that tends to weave back and forth between sardonic and what I can best describe as a fleeting sense of sort of maybe sincere, but please don't hold me to it, something like that, if that makes sense. And yeah, not quite sure what it could have been about that moment in time during the pandemic that made me connect with that tone. I really can't figure it out. I don't know. Anyway, it also doesn't hurt that everything about his recordings, to my ear, is completely in the pocket. From the interplay of melody and harmony to instrumentation and production. I mean, even if I wasn't a convert to his work, I'd have to admit it sounds immaculate in a kind of casual way that is disarming. So yeah, Mahashmashana continues that trend while expanding on it, and I do highly recommend it. And now to our useful item. So if you're like me and a lot of people I know, election night and the days since have been, to put it lightly, incredibly disappointing. Where I am in Florida, we were really hoping a ballot initiative would pass to roll back restrictions on abortion in the state and enshrine reproductive rights in the state's constitution. Unfortunately, due to Florida's 60% threshold for passing these kinds of things, the initiative failed. But really, even if it had passed, I'm not sure how much it would have mattered in the long run, because no matter what BS Trump said to get elected, it is likely that the erosion of reproductive rights in this country is going to only continue, perhaps even with some version of a national ban. So now is really the time for people to prepare for that eventuality. And Jessica Valenti, as usual, had great advice to share about this in her newsletter, which is called Abortion Every Day. And the day after the election, she sent out what she called, quote, 5 things you can do right now, how to protect yourself and each other, end quote. And I'll link to this in the show notes for the episode, along with everything else discussed. But here's the overview. 1, order abortion medication. 2, donate to an abortion fund or organization. 3, protect your digital safety, and do this by turning off your location sharing, trading out text messaging for an app like Signal, disabling ad ID tracking, and using a VPN. 4, know your legal rights, and 5, check in with your community. And I think the way I just read all of that off sounds very straightforward and I don't know, not a lot to it, but go and read the newsletter. As she points out in the post, the laws around abortion didn't change overnight. So these are things you can do now to help further down the line, if that makes sense. And she goes into really useful detail about how each one of those suggestions specifically helps or can help. So like I said, I definitely recommend you check it out. And now here's the kind of what I'm calling the Stereoactive bulletin board, some things that are going on behind the scenes or whatever at Stereoactive Media. So the main thing to let you know about is that Stereoactive Media just relaunched the When We See Each Other podcast, which I produce with host Nikisha McLeod. And here's a producer's note we included when the first new episode went out on November 8th. We're proud to finally officially relaunch When We See Each Other with the first new episode of the podcast in over 3 years. This has been in the works for months, and we recorded this episode with Supernova back in mid-September. Obviously, though, the week preceding this release brought about major news that really shook us up. As much as we wish circumstances didn't make it so, hearing the stories of BIPOC and LGBTQIA+ voices is even more important now than it was when we recorded this, and especially the voices of trans and non-binary folks who have been very specifically targeted by the incoming regime. The stories heard on this show are ones of positivity, intend to invoke the power of music and art in the realization and expression of ideas and identity. They stand in clear contrast to the information and bigotry that is much too pervasive in our world, and we hope you'll listen and support these artists and their work. And since then, we've also released a second new episode featuring Najla Saeed, the author of a book called Looking for Palestine, Growing Up Confused in an Arab American Family, which discusses her perspective as a Palestinian Lebanese American. So I hope you'll go and listen to both of those episodes. Also, both When We See Each Other, the podcast, and Stereoactive Media are now on Blue Sky, so please follow us there. And again, links for all the stuff mentioned in this episode will be in the show notes, so please go read those for more information about anything you heard here. Thank you for listening to Stereoactive Presents. The music in this episode is composed by Hansdale Sue and Maya McDonald. My name is Jeremiah Lee McVeigh. If you like what you hear in the show, please rate and review it in Good Pods, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else that allows that. Doing so helps us to expand our audience and is much appreciated. And please follow us wherever you happen to listen to podcasts. Every little bit helps and is truly appreciated again. You can also get in touch with us at stereoactivemedia@gmail.com, and you can find more information about this show and everything else that Stereoactive Media is involved with at stereoactivemedia.com. Now let's end the episode with the trailer we put out recently to coincide with the launch of Season 2 of When We See Each Other.
Hello, world. My name is Nikisha McLeod. When We See Each Other is a podcast that focuses on music and art by BIPOC, queer, trans, and non-binary artists, as well as artists I've met and known for some time. Producer, multi-instrumentalist, singer-songwriter, Supernova.
You know, it took some time in therapy to really get out the internalized transphobia and really be proud of who I was and realize the obvious that there's nothing wrong with being transgender and it's a beautiful gift and just another example of the million ways you could live a life and the beautiful, diverse complexity of our world.
The Black, queer, gender, non-conforming femme R&B artist, Nyola.
Me just choosing to write about my experiences and like to write about softness and to write about emotion and vulnerability, that within itself is an act of liberation and an act of defiance because I'm not supposed to speak.
I'm not just a boy, I'm a man. I'm not just a man, I'm a god.
Black trans artist and Jimmy Lee.
It's funny because I came out in this song before I came out in real life. I didn't realize until years later that this song related to my trans masculine identity. And at the time I was still exploring what trans meant and not really thinking too much on it. And I also relate my gender and my queerness to my sense of spirituality.
My markings in
the amazing rapper Billy Dean Thomas. Just to end, I'm wondering, can you give us a few bars?
Yeah.
I need a moment to process. Hit a prophet like Nostradamus, but not talking commas. Yeah, you smart, but don't got no common sense. Like Bruce Willis got 6 senses to kill us. I'm seeing ghosts of these rappers when I open up my pen. It's the thought for sustenance. Look at the shit we up against. I got beats abundances. We flowing together like ligaments. And yeah, I'm glad I'm pigmented. Hate the pigs in the system.
You can find more information about this show at stereoactivemedia.com/whenweseeeachother. And please follow us wherever you happen to listen to podcasts.
This podcast is produced by Stereoactive Media.